We are here to listen to Ed DeSeve, who's going to talk to us about the road to agile government, your journey to a new way of achieving your mission. So we're looking very forward to this webinar today. Ed, if you don't mind advancing the slide. So today's webinar is brought to you by the American Society for Quality, ASQ, and the ASQ Government Division. I am Mark Burson. I'm the ASQ Government Division Chair. And we also have Neota Brown, who's going to be helping us as she is the technical lead for this event. And we are looking forward to this. A little bit about ASQ. ASQ, the American Society for Quality, represents the voice of quality throughout the world with over 80,000 members. The government division is one out of 26 divisions in the society, and we're a community of practitioners focused on quality and performance improvement for federal, state, local, and international governments. We are composed of government leaders and employees, seasoned experts, consultants, practitioners, university professors, students, and others engaged with or interested in the public sector. So we encourage you to join our community. And you could get to our community by going to asq.org and looking for, under communities, you could find us under the government division. We do several webinars, typically about one a month, and we typically announce these through LinkedIn and through the ASQ Government Division website and through ASQ. So feel free to check us out. You also, for those of you that are interested, you can earn some credits towards CPUs or RUs and things like that. So for today's webinar, use the Q&A tab to send in any questions that you have during the webinar. What we're going to do is after the presentation, we'll allow about 10 minutes or so for a Q&A session, and I'll relay any questions that you have to Ed. Yeah, you send in your questions, just use the Q&A chat or the Q&A box on the right bottom of your screen. Also, at the end of the presentation, there's a list of division officers, our contact information, as well as the contact information of our speaker, which is Ed today. And also, most of our presentations are available for download within a few days of the webinar. And again, you can go to the Government Division website for that. So I want to say a few words about Ed. Ed DeSeve, as he was a special advisor to President Barack Obama, and he oversaw the successful implementation of the $787 billion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. He is currently coordinator of the Agile Government Center at the National Academy of Public Administration, and he's a visiting fellow of the IBM Center for the Business of Government. His career has included work in finance, academia, and government. Mr. DeSeve was the founder and president of Public Financial Management, the U.S.'s largest independent financial advisor to governments. At Merrill Lynch Capital Markets, he was managing director in charge of public finance in a 20-state region. He was also the controller and deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level, as well as a chief financial officer at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So Ed has a tremendous amount of experience and background. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ed DeSeve. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate your kind introduction. I want to give you a sense of where Agile government came from and hopefully where it's going. Many of you probably know that the Agile Manifesto for software development was created about 10 or 12 years ago at a ski resort in Utah, which sounds like a good thing to me. I've skied that resort. It's a good place to have a conversation. And software developers realized that the waterfall method that they used for many, many years was an inefficient and counterproductive way of developing new software. So they put in place a new set of principles. I'm not going to go over those in great detail, but the principles were designed to increase the speed at which development occurred and to heavily involve users in small bursts which allowed them to quickly develop functionality that could be analyzed rather than waiting until the end and having either a go or no-go kind of a proposition. About a year and a half ago, I sat down at lunch. Most of the important things in my life have occurred around lunch, and you can see that in my visage here, with Terry Gerton. Terry is the president of the National Academy of Public Administration, where I'm a fellow. I suspect that I'm talking to more than a few of the fellows from the National Academy right now. And Terry and I both expressed a frustration that the management principles around government, particularly in my case, the federal government, although by extension to other governments at the state level, the local level, and internationally, that our frustration was that while we had lots of different frameworks and ways to think about things, that we didn't have something that was comparable to the Agile Manifesto developed in the software arena. I set out about a year ago working with my friends at the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Dan Chinnock is the unindicted co-conspirator in charge of this project at IBM. And we convened a roundtable, and again, there may be some folks here in this group that are part of that, were part of that roundtable. And we said to ourselves, if we were going to set up a set of principles for Agile government, what would those principles look like? And for the past year, we've been looking at those principles and refining them. We created something called the Agile Government Center, and if you go on the NAPA website and scroll down just a little bit, you'll find the National Academy of Public Administration website. You'll find information about the Agile Government Center. There's a series of blogs there that look at what Agile government is, how it relates to federalism, and looks around the world at instances, cases from New Zealand, cases from Australia, cases from Europe, cases involving the World Bank that demonstrate how Agile and Agile principles can actually work. Very shortly, hopefully by November 9th, the IBM Center and the National Academy will publish something called The Road to Agile Government. And we believe that this is kind of a marker. I wrote it, so I believe it, is kind of a marker that indicates what we've done in the last year and where we're going for the future. I encourage you to tune in either at IBM Center for the Business of Government or at the NAPA website on or about the 10th of November to get your own copy and download it. What you're getting today is really a preview. You're getting an insider's view into where we stand on the Agile government principles. And let me turn to the first slide. This is the logo of the Agile Government Center, and it talks about the fact that it's a partnership between NAPA and IBM, where I'm also a visiting fellow. What Agile government is a common sense set of applications of Agile government principles. And I'm going to move, here we go, I'm going to move Mark over a little bit. The common sense application of Agile government principles to managing regulations, policies, and programs at all three levels of government: the project level, the program level, and the whole of government level. Now, that's a fairly short sentence, and it's got a mouthful in it. Regulations. Right now, the World Economic Forum is continuing to look at the nature of regulatory change and how regulatory change can become more agile, how it can bring users, especially in the areas of regulating technology, Right now, technology regulation is very, very difficult. Why? Because the complexity of technology has grown exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years. And for an outside entity, a government, to try to regulate it without regard to what's going on within the industry itself is impossible. The Japanese have taken a significant lead in the area. MITI, the Japanese government's technology arm, MITI, has looked carefully at how they involve the regulated in helping to create the regulations. The hearings we saw this morning in the Congress indicate that Congress hasn't figured out how to legislate, and we also can look at various regulations at agencies or at the OMB level, and that similarly is true. So what we want to do is we want to bring Agile principles, which we'll talk about in a minute, to regulation. We also want to bring them to policy development. When I think about government policies, I realize that often they're made by a series of experts in isolation from the reality that is existing on the ground. So we're starting to find, again, that Agile principles can be used in policies. And thirdly, in programs. This is the one that probably comes to your mind first when you think about using Agile principles. How do I take my project? How do I take a larger program? How do I take the whole of government and bring Agile principles to it? And implementation of projects, one of the things we found was that some of the folks who are doing technology work, the folks at GSA, the folks in the digital service, are starting to develop not just technology solutions, but they're morphing into organizational solutions. There's a professor in Germany whose name is Ines Merkel, and Ines has been doing the same thing. She's been looking very carefully at how these technology enablers have been actually changing organizations, especially at the project level. As we move up to the program level, we see examples in lots of different places where programs, like the implementation of the Data Act, we have a case study on the website that Amy Edwards from Treasury did that talks about how the Data Act was implemented consciously using Agile principles. And so here we have a whole program that was done more quickly and was done better in the eyes of the users as a result of using Agile principles. And finally, we go to the whole of government level. We haven't seen this very often, but we're starting to see in places like the United Arab Emirates, an entire government think about how to use Agile principles and guiding it in making changes that are significant in the society as well as in the government. Let's look at Agile government principles and see what they look like. It'd be really good if I could advance my slide. How about that? There we go. Sorry, I have to go back one. I'm going to have to go to escape and then I have to start the show again to show how agile I am. There we go. These are nothing new. Mark was kind enough to call them an amalgam which is stronger than any one of the elements by itself. The things you see here really are a common sense checklist. When the white paper from NAPA and the IBM Center come out, you begin to see in detail how we're talking about these things. What we try to do is apply the principle of simultaneity, if we can say it. Mission. All too often, we kind of check the box on mission and move on to do something else. What we found, and this is well known in the quality field, what we found is that if the mission resonates throughout the organization on a continuing basis, and if the mission adequately describes the ends we have in sight, what we're trying to do, then that mission is the guiding light. I was in NASA Huntsville a couple of years ago, and the NASA mission was in front of everyone I talked to at Huntsville. I was doing a presentation, an educational presentation for Brookings. And the mission was right there. They could see themselves in the NASA mission. They could see how Huntsville was applying the elements of the NASA mission. When I ran the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we were very fortunate that the elements of our mission were stated in the first page of the legislation of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. And what that said was, you need to do 5 things. You have 5 elements to your mission. 1, create and save jobs. 2, help those individuals who've been most hurt by the economic downturn. 3, worry about solving problems in old infrastructure, helping with highways, helping with water and sewer programs. 4, innovate. Bring new infrastructure online, whether that's wireless infrastructure, whatever it is, but innovate carefully and clearly in a thoughtful way. And finally, make sure that state budgets are not overwhelmed by the revenue downturns that they see. We were able to take that mission and put it up on the wall, and every so often look at it and say, how we're doing, how are we doing? And what that created was the second item in our Agile government principles, that's metrics for success. What we found retrospectively is that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act led to, along with monetary policy of the Fed, led to significantly longer recoveries in the economy in terms of jobs, in terms of GDP growth. I'm forgetting the exact number. It was something like 128 consecutive months where job growth and GDP growth occurred. The longest recovery ever. It's our first metric. The second one, looking at the individuals, we were able to demonstrate the number of individuals who were given payments for Medicaid, payments for Social Security, individual cash payments. We could look at those people and see that they continued to have their Medicaid health care and continued to have the kind of income availability from unemployment insurance as well as from Social Security that was necessary. That's been mirrored, obviously, and appropriately in the CARES Act. The CARES Act took some of the individuals, the payments to individuals, and brought them forward. We then look at the next, so metrics for success are simply a proper reflection of your mission. And we all know, we've all seen what the wonderful work that Dustin Brown and others have done at OMB in creating program metrics within the federal government. We then look at customer-driven behavior. What does customer-driven behavior mean? In the Data Act, the Treasury reached out to many federal users. I've forgotten the exact number. It's in the case study, and asked each of those users to evaluate the current state of data availability and the future state that they were beginning to design. They continuously asked them to participate in design activities. And the Treasury's comment and the comment of the individuals, the satisfaction of the individuals in those circumstances was a very significant driver of the fact that the Data Act was implemented successfully within congressional guidelines and much more rapidly than similar systems that have been put in place by the Treasury. Customer-driven behavior was essential there. It was essential in other places. When we look at the case study for New Zealand, we find that involving the beneficiaries of social service programs in helping to think through and design those programs, especially for individuals who are parts of, I'll use the word ethnic minority, but that's an inappropriate reference. It's really looking to indigenous people within New Zealand who had been left behind, bringing them to the fore and having them help in the New Zealand case study design the kind of changes that were necessary was terribly important. External networks. John Koskinen, my dear friend and former boss, is kind of one of the gurus of external networks. John in Y2K looked carefully at how we were going to implement rapidly without a lot of federal funds available to help. There were some, but not a lot. How we were going to implement the kind of changes that were necessary to assure that the computer glitch that everybody was convinced was going to happen didn't happen as the millennium changed. What John did is he created a series of external networks. These were networks that were done on an industry-by-industry basis, letting the industry individuals, the people who ran the nuclear programs, for example, the people who ran the major banks and financial institutions, they were the people who created the networks and worked with their federal counterparts. So the Energy Department worked with the people who were in the utilities that were being asked to change their policies. We worked internationally with the UN and the stockpile of nuclear materials that was existing around the world to make sure that they were safeguarded through networks. I'm such a believer in external networks that if I had one thing to do, I would encourage everyone to work through and create networks. It's not an accident that we talk about the Agile Government Network. It's more than 50 individuals, some of whom I'm sure are on the call today, who help us think through Agile Government principles, help us develop Agile Government cases, help us bring the ideas behind Agile to people around the world. When I say around the world, on November 17th, the Agile Government Network will convene a meeting on behalf of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of our network partners, as is the World Economic Forum. And at OECD, we will think about the nature of the pandemic as it currently exists and think about what kind of Agile techniques can be brought to helping to not have the pandemic be so poorly implemented internationally in the future, how to recover after the pandemic has been put in place, and other issues that we're currently developing, so that we work with our external network partners to try to think with them about how responses can be put together and how economic recovery and resilience can occur. And we need to do this at speed. There was a deadline in Y2K, and that was the year 2000. It wasn't going away. And it needed to move very, very quickly in order to have the solutions that needed to be in place. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act promised that within 18 months of enactment, we would have spent 80%, not obligated, but expended 80% of the funds along the way. Why? Because we wanted to create jobs as quickly as we possibly could. I used one example in the upcoming white paper, and that talks about wildfires. Wildfires and the responses that have been created by the National Wildfire Center are inherently agile. I watched a fire being fought about 3 years ago in Idaho, where 1,500 people were assembled virtually overnight in tent camps to fight the Beaver Creek fire. They had the food they needed, they had the shelter they needed, they had the gasoline they needed for their vehicles, they had the equipment they needed, they had the coordination that was necessary. And again, it happened very quickly. The metrics for that fire were there were no lives lost, there was about 200,000 acres were burned, and only one house, which happened to be a house made of cedar shakes with a cedar shake roof, only one house was lost, despite the fact that the fire came very close to a residential community. So speed. We talk about highly skilled, empowered, diverse, cross-functional teams and really internal networks. External networks are those like our work with the OECD. But when we bring together individuals who are highly skilled, who have different points of view about how the problem can be solved, who represent all of the functions that are possible to be used in a particular area, and are empowered, are given the ability to design new ways of thinking. The World Bank case study demonstrates the use of these kinds of teams and internal networks. Significant speed was able to be generated within the World Bank. That is, they were able to reduce the cycle time from the point at which an application was brought forward to the point at which a grant was either awarded or denied. They cut the cycle time by, I'm doing this out of memory, you can go read the case, by something like 60%. And at the same time, they lowered the cost of processing these kinds of applications. They did it by creating cross-functional teams where different groups within the bank were working together on a network basis and were empowered by senior management all the way up to the CEO of the bank and his staff were empowered to make decisions at an appropriate level and get things done quickly and reach out to the external networks who were customers from nations around the world. Innovation. I don't have to convince this group about the importance of innovation. We, within Agile, have to continuously say, how do we do this differently? NASA used to talk about better, faster, cheaper. That's part of it, but how do we do it in such a way that we can significantly impact the mission of the organization in a new way and enable us to do more? Persistence. The continual trying and failing and trying and failing. I'm not in favor of the idea of failing forward. I think that's a bad truism. But what we really have in terms of persistence is the willingness to experiment, the willingness to try things and to do things better as a result of what we're trying to do. I'm a big believer. I've failed so many times in so many activities that if I hadn't picked myself up, dusted myself off, and started again, I wouldn't have been as successful as I've been in my career. Franklin Roosevelt said, don't fear to fail. Try something. If it doesn't work, admit it and try something else. We do that wherever we can by using evidence-informed solutions. I called this something else, and part of our network, Dean Angela Evans from the University of Texas LBJ School said, no, we use evidence to inform our solutions. Our solutions aren't evidence-based, but they're informed by different kinds of evidence. How do we take the ideas that we have in climate change? How do we look at the evidence that particular pathogens are causing the COVID virus to occur? How do we take that and quickly, using cross-functional teams of vaccine creators, create a vaccine that will allow us to go back to something that looks like the new normal? So evidence is the gold standard. Now, everybody cannot do trials. We can't do everything along the way through random control trials. It doesn't work that way. We wish it did, but it doesn't. So how do you take the best evidence that you can and use that as quickly as you can, using the cross-functional experts that you have in place and innovating based on this evidence along the way? That's the kind of question that we're trying to deal with. All of this entire framework, all of these principles can only be put in play with organizational leaders who are willing to go forward and do it. I'm not making a political statement here. I've written in another white paper for the IBM Center for the Business of Government about the effect that President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden had on the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Barack Obama, in his first State of the Union address, said, I'm placing this in the hands of Joe Biden because nobody messes with Joe. Continually, President Obama was clear that the Vice President had his complete confidence in working to try to do the 5 things that we talked about earlier as part of the mission of the Recovery Act. And Joe Biden, and I've said this again, I realize I'm in an electoral cycle here, Joe Biden exhibited extraordinary leadership and attention to detail along the way in getting things done. The same thing was true at the World Bank. The head of the World Bank and the CEO both made it clear that the Agile journey, the bank's Agile journey, was essential to its continuing to fight poverty. The mission of the World Bank is to end poverty, end world poverty. That's a pretty clear mission, and it's certainly a super ambitious one along the way. So here we have a set of Agile government principles. And again, there's nothing new, nothing that people in this organization haven't heard. But if you put those on your wall and you continually ask yourself things like the Baldrige questions, questions about, is my mission clear? Do I really have a sense that I have communicated to others the nature of the speed that must be put in place? Am I willing to use evidence to give me the best possible way of thinking about what's going on? So to me, I've been at this government management thing for more than 50 years. And what I needed to do is I needed to write these down somewhere where I could see them, and I needed to test them against a series of cases. I'm not going to walk you through the cases, but rather I'm going to refer you to the NAPA website, where you can find each of these cases and others that are a demonstration from the people who are actually involved in doing things. There are more cases coming forward, and please, to the extent that you have a case of your own which you think exhibits Agile principles, how they actually were put in place. The New Zealand healthcare case was not a situation in which they started out to make things more agile. But in retrospect, the Australian-New Zealand School of Government, who helped us prepare the case, looked at what happened in the indigenous healthcare that was occurring in New Zealand and said, you know, without realizing it, they used Agile principles to make this happen. We welcome other cases. We're in the process of setting up our next round of cases. We welcome additional cases. I think my email is on the back. You can just email me a note. We've been very lucky to have the Institute for Successful Societies at Princeton help us develop a case template, and they helped us in detail doing the World Bank case. So there are a series of cases out there. We are happy to supply expertise to individuals and agencies. We're very fortunate that Joe Mitchell, who is one of Terry Gerton's deputies at NAPA, is a real devotee of Agile. Joe has gotten a grant from the Freeman Foundation, Samuel Freeman Foundation, and funding from the Project Management Institute. I suspect there are some PMI folks on this call as well. They are in the process of looking at Agile government within the federal government and looking at what the current state is and how the federal government may become more Agile. I expect we're going to see some material on that within the next month or so, and a final briefing that will be prepared for the next presidential term. Again, I don't know who the incumbent is going to be, but we want to get the ideas of Agile in the federal government in front of them, and Joe and PMI and the Samuel Freeman Foundation have been a tremendous help in putting that together. Here is the website for the Agile Government Center, and we would be happy now, I think I'm on time, Mark, to take questions. It's my phone says it's now 12:35, and we'd be happy to take questions. So Mark, I'm going to turn it back to you to be the MC on the questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed. That was incredible, very informative. You do have a couple of questions. I encourage others to send in additional questions as we're going through the Q&A session here. We actually do have still a fair amount of time left during this webinar. Here's one question that has come in. How do we manage unintended consequences for change that happen in a rapid fashion? Software has an established process of testing and error correction via new releases, but government delivery lacks those timely tools and are often tied up in legislative oversight.
That's a very compound and complex question. Let me try to go backwards. To the extent that your mission is clear and has been agreed to, not just by your own organization, but by the overseers, whether they be the overseers from congressional committees or the overseers from GAO or the IG's office, the clarity of mission begins to give you a place to stand and defend your territory in that circumstance. What we then realize is that to the extent that your customers, and I realize that customer is a very difficult word in the federal government. There are probably a number of definitions, and they're all correct about who the customers are. I can have that conversation. It's a wonderful conversation to have. But to the extent that the customers, and in this case, we'll say the direct users of your program, are part of the solution, are helping you to look at the nature of implementation, look at the nature of regulation, look at the nature of policies, and help in their design, you will have two important legs of the stool in place. That is a clear mission and customers working together. I would add to that the ability to continually use evidence to create metrics helps you as well. Now, when you're called before a congressional committee and asked to explain yourself for why you did this and why you did that, why this failed and why that failed, it isn't going to be easy. I've been there. I had to make those kinds of explanations, and it's not pretty. But to the extent that you can reference, you have a referenceable set of principles that allow you to say, we may not have been as successful as we would have liked to have been, but we tried to do it with a method that was itself inherently appropriate. And that's the other reason for Agile government principles. They provide you a bit, only a bit, of a safe harbor as you go about your work. If you can say to people, I use the best principles available. This is what the National Academy of Public Administration, this is what people in schools of public administration around the nation are using, and we use those, it's helpful. Again, you will not always succeed, but to the extent that you've used a methodology that is similar to the tried and true testing, that you'll be better off along the way.
Thanks, Ed. Here's another question for you. And since we're sort of on the topic of speed, government isn't known for speed. What would you recommend to strengthen delivery in lieu of a series of waiting gates for multi-level review and approval cycles?
Let me go back again, and I apologize for beating this horse. John Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon in this decade. He said man, he could have said something else, I guess, but he didn't. That put a marker down, that put a metric out there, that put a mission out there. NASA then worked backwards from that deadline so that to the extent that you have a marker and that marker creates a deadline and you work backwards from that deadline, you can create the gates that are necessary to get to the point along the way. John Koskinen had a Y2K deadline of the coming of the millennium. He went backwards. One of the most frightening occurrences in my career was going to the Atlantic City-based FAA center, technical center, and being shown the last remaining mainframe core item that existed as a spare for one of the air traffic control computers. There was only one left, and IBM wasn't an IBM product. It wasn't making any more. We needed to develop a way, without putting a brand new system in place, to make sure that we could use the existing things that we did. We took the external network that was available in air traffic and worked backwards with them to create a series of milestones that needed to be met by the airlines, by the air traffic control community, by the, in some cases, the aircraft manufacturers themselves, get to where we needed to go. So I think by setting a marker, setting a time frame in the future, again in the American Recovery Act, I had to get $570 billion out the door by September 30th, 2010. In order to do that, I had biweekly financial reporting. In biweekly financial reporting, that is twice a week, I got information from the programs through an accounting system that was put in place, an overlay on their accounting systems, tell me how many dollars had been expended and how many dollars had been obligated. And to the extent that there was lagging, the leadership, that is the vice president or the president or the OMB director, would make it very clear to the grantees, state and local governments in particular, or federal agencies, that there needed to be better speed. Again, I can't give you a recipe for how to create those gates. The gates are mission specific, but having the networks involved in solving the problems gives you a significant amount of leverage over the problems. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question for you, Ed. Do you think the use of a measurable standard for process improvement activity would be helpful, as basically the government division has proposed such a thing that will facilitate the kind of agility in government we are seeking?
I really do. I really think that the more processes that can be put in place where there is clarity for how programs can be implemented, how to do it, and then the continual checking along the way. It doesn't have to be an absolute standard. It can be a standard. What I use something like the Baldrige questions in evaluating how governments are actually functioning, and we use that as a diagnostic tool. It gives us a sense of according to about 125 questions in the survey now, gives us a sense to what the baseline is. The question then, once you have the diagnosis, what is the prescription? What kinds of things need to be changed? Do we need better communications? Do we need better internal controls? These are all related to questions along the way. To the extent that we can put something like that in play, that allow people to do their own benchmarking, to look at their own success as an organization, success as a leader in communicating, success in getting the public on board, success in a whole variety of activities. To the extent that we can put that in place and have it be what we call a rebuttable presumption, you're supposed to be able to communicate well, you're supposed to have a high level of integrity in your programs. You're supposed to use technology in an appropriate way. These are all standards that can be put in place. It isn't going to be a single rigid standard. It isn't going to look like testing materials. But what it can look like is an agreed upon group of questions and group of ideas about how organizations should run, that if you deviate from that, or if your organization believes, people within your organization believe that you're deviating with it, then truth can be spoken to power. People within parts of the organization, and the employee viewpoint survey is certainly a start at that. But we need to go beyond that. We need to have managers continuously assess the performance of their organizations in some way.
All right. Another question for you. What is the strategy that NAPA is using to promote Agile government principles with political leaders?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure we've gotten to that yet. Right now, we're in the business of articulating the principles. The white paper coming out in early November, is going to give us a platform. And with that platform, we're going to spend time talking with some of our own fellows who are either current or former leaders in this area. The political cadre that leads in the federal government consists of the House and the Senate, and we work through the committees, obviously, that are in play. I'm hoping to engage the committee members and the committee chairs in the next Congress, both in the Senate and in the House, in the conversation around Agile government. Beyond that, we are, again, it's early in the day, but we're going to reach out to governors and to county executives and to city managers. I've talked to people in all of those organizations, people at the NGA, people at the ICMA, and so on. And we're going to reach out to them and go to their meetings and talk about Agile government principles with the individuals who are in charge of those governments. We would have done more, to be perfectly honest with you, without the COVID problems that we have. We would have done more of that as we developed the principles to begin with. We did some of it, and our Agile Government Network includes people in those kinds of organizations. But it's something we need to do, and we need to get their feedback. The principles are designed to be changed. We designed them in such a way that as they're expanded or as people bring new ideas to them, we will modify the description of the principle to reflect an agreement that there are better ways to state and say it. So outreach to come in the Congress, outreach to come across governors, county executives, city managers. I'm not sure we'll go to state legislators right away. I think there's only a certain number of people we can go to, but for those interested, we will spend the time and energy talking with them along the way. Now, if anybody has a bunch of money that they want to contribute here, please let us know. We would be happy, NAPA would be happy to expand its ability to do these things. Right now, my salary for the Agile Government Center is infinite. That is, it's zero. And it will continue to be zero along the way. We will at some point have to bring more bodies into the mix, do the kind of outreach we're talking about. And again, thanks to PMI, thanks to the Samuel Freeman Foundation for helping us on the federal level.
Sounds good. Is evidence-based policy making, we talk about evidence quite a bit in Agile, is evidence-based policy making a step in the right direction for incorporating Agile into creating or refining policy?
The answer is yes, yes, and yes. Agile cannot be successful unless it brings forward the kind of evidence that a particular program or a particular project or a particular policy has some hope of working. Simply to blindly attempt to do things, or do things, this is where we always did it, or do things to satisfy interest groups is foolish. It makes no sense at all. So the quest has to continually be to bring more evidence to the fore in designing policies, implementing programs, and carrying out projects. How do we get evidence? We ask for it. We do it the old-fashioned way. We ask for it. We look for it. When we get better evidence, we modify the evidence that currently exists, that something works or doesn't work. My friend Robert Shea, God bless him, and the Evidence Commission that was established by Congress has given us some good roadmaps for this. So I think we'll need to watch those roadmaps along the way.
Excellent. I know Robert Shea very well. Another question for you. As evidence is foundational to Agile, and this is maybe a really big question, do you think parts of government or even the public at large no longer sees the value of evidence and facts to drive thoughtful change? And if that's the case, how do we move the needle in the right direction?
The electorate, as it exists now, if you surveyed them and asked them whether they thought that government was evidence-based or not, would probably say, no, they just do what they want to do. They just do what they think works. But there would not be a significant customer groundswell that government has an evidence base. Why? Because we haven't effectively gathered the evidence and marketed it along the way. Let me give you an example. One of the things that the Roosevelt administration during the New Deal decided is they're going to put this radical new program in place called the Social Security system, where people who were older were going to get payments essentially from people who were younger. It's an intergenerational wealth transfer. Yes, we all pay into it, but most often the money we pay into it is used to pay benefits to people who are already out there. It's not a savings program in that sense. What this has done, and the evidence is very clear, is fundamentally eliminated poverty among the elderly as a class. Now, will there be poor people who are old? Yes. But as a class, there was a time when people who were old were also poor. They had no pension. They had nothing to fall back on. They needed to use their families or charity along the way. That's evidence. We can show the nature of that evidence. Unless we can find evidence on a continuing basis for the programs that we want to demonstrate, we will not be able to get people to understand what we're trying to do, how we're trying to accomplish our mission along the way. So I don't think the public gets it, but I think a good organization that communicates with the public about the value of their mission based on evidence, and again, I'll use NASA again. NASA is one of the most admired organizations because people understand that we're exploring space. People understand that we're acting as a steward for the world as it currently exists. People get it, and they get it because they see missions being accomplished. They see pictures of rovers on Mars. They see people in space stations. They get it. We need to have an undertaking to create that kind of information, that kind of evidence for all of the programs that we undertake. If we can't demonstrate that we are actually solving a problem, then we should stop doing the function. And we should let people know through a massive communication program what evidence we're using, what results we hope to get, and whether we got them or not. And we don't do a very good job of that at all.
So along the lines of evidence, we had another individual write in that there are lessons to be learned from President Obama's program for citizen engagement. To whom should I show evidence of what did not work for stopping the drop in the public trust?
We all should figure out, I'm going to answer the question, I've got to do it round the back door. We should all look at the data on public trust that exists out there. The people at Gallup do some work, the people at Pew do some work, and there are others. I cite a couple of them in the white paper that's coming out. Public trust is only able to be gotten by doing the right thing and doing it in the right way. So we have to carefully choose how we're engaging people, and we have to carefully measure the way that engagement was successful or unsuccessful. There's a Brookings book that looked at evidence base within the Obama administration and demonstrated that they were quite successful. The administration was quite successful in certain programs. What they didn't, by using evidence, what they didn't do is they didn't look at other programs where there was no evidence, where success may or may not have occurred. So for me, it's identifying the elements of the mission, the metrics that are going to be used, backing them up in first with evidence as we design the program, and then demonstrating through evidence that we actually solved a particular problem. Example, Superfund sites. We all believe that if we can eliminate Superfund sites, we will have a better environment, certainly in the area in which we are working. It may or may not spill over into global climate change. We need to let people understand that. If you read Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, if you haven't read it, you should go out and buy it. It's a very small book. I haven't bought it yet. I read it, but I didn't buy it. I got it at the library. And what he says, he looks at the area around Hanford, Washington, and demonstrates how horribly difficult it is, even with evidence, to demonstrate to people the importance of cleaning up the massive nuclear waste that's there. But over time, they were able to do that because they could show that the water quality was better, the air quality was better, the level of radiation was better. So being able to demonstrate with evidence that cleaning up a nuclear program, even over many decades, was actually beginning to show results, the results that they had designed at the beginning, is actually helping the continuation of that program. There's other reasons the program is continuing, but that was a big part of it. And the fifth risk, for those of you who haven't read the book, the fifth risk is program implementation. It's being able to do the things we say we're going to do.
All right, fantastic. We're going to try to get a couple more questions in before the end of the hour. You had mentioned earlier that you're trying to involve counties and states in some of what you're doing. Will there be a sign-up list to register municipal governments to participate?
My hope is to work with the National League of Cities, to work, see again, what we're going to do, which we're going to swallow our own medicine. We're going to create external networks. And we're going to work with the National League of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the International City and County Management Association, and ask them to reach out to their members and inform their members, but also get feedback from their members on the nature of Agile government and how it can be implemented in their areas. Also, to ask for help. We hope to be able to have resources. Hope is not a strategy. We hope to be able to have resources to help communities that are interested in doing this. So we're going to use, this is what we did in the Recovery Act. We used the NGA, the National Governors Association, as a conduit. We used the Government Finance Officers Association as a conduit for financial information. And we'll continue to use that. So there's no sign-up sheet. Just go to an external network partner near you, and we'll reach out. Again, resources are lacking. So we're going to do the best we can with what we have and hope to use the resources of others to help us along the way.
One couple more questions. How do you increase transparency when working with a diverse group with different professional skill sets?
I think what you do is you try to create homogeneity among the skill sets as they exist. So if you have a group of people who have very little understanding of program outcome measurement of metrics, but they have a great deal of understanding of measuring the inputs, you enable them to work together and do the things that they do in their own skill set well, and then introduce them to the other skill sets and see how cross-fertilization can take place. If you were establishing metrics, you would need to have lots of different kinds of metrics, metrics on inputs, metrics on outputs, metrics on outcomes. Some people are better at inputs, some people are better at outcomes. But the relationship between inputs, outputs, and outcomes should be clear among a group of people, each of whom has an experience with one of the elements of the factors. So you take a diverse, cross-functional group of people and let them understand how the work of others contributes to the success of the overall organization. I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Well, Ed, speaking of metrics, I have to say, this has been a tremendous session, fantastic discussion. We got a lot of engagement. These all contribute to a successful webinar. I really appreciate your time. We're at 1 o'clock Eastern, top of the hour here, and I really appreciate everyone's participation, and I especially appreciate Ed, you joining us today, and I really hope everyone has a fantastic day or the rest of the day. So I really appreciate it, Ed.
Thanks very much. I appreciate what ASQ stands for and what they do.
Fantastic. All right, everyone have a great day, or rest of your morning or evening, wherever you may be. And again, if you have any additional questions, there are some